Hey guys, so if you've been following my channel for a while, you might remember that a couple years ago I put out a video called How to Get a Good Metal Tone in Logic Pro. Now at the time that tone was a breakthrough for me, and when I look back at that video, a lot of the things I say in it are still how I feel about guitar tone today. But there was one thing I said that I think was more of an assumption rather than experience with guitar. And that was when I said that obviously it would be better to use a real amp. But what's funny is I think my perspective has slightly changed now. Back then, I used to look at amp sims as sort of an unfortunate necessity. It'd be awesome if I had a great cab and amp that I could mic, but I just have to use these amp sims because that's all I have right now. But my perspective has kind of changed a little bit. The more I've worked with them, the more experience I've gained. Slowly but surely, I've learned how to shape and craft and make subtle adjustments until now I've been able to achieve a tone that I'm actually quite satisfied with. I just recently put out a new song called For You, and if you haven't seen it, I'll post a link so you can check it out, but I'm actually very pleased with the guitar tone I was able to get in that. If you watch my videos chronologically, you'll hear me gradually saying, amp sims are okay, and little by little, but now I'm actually kind of a fan of amp sims. I used to hate them, or I used to just think like, this is all I got, but now I like them. I mean, they're just so convenient, and it's just so nice to have like a solid tone that you can just plug in and use right away, and you always have the option to kind of make subtle adjustments and tweak it afterwards. You're not stuck with the one tone, although commitment is kind of an important thing. I'll talk about that later in the video. I've gone from coming up with a decent tone to something that I think is totally usable, so let me go ahead and give you an example of what I was able to come up with. So if we have a look here, this is the old tone that I was able to achieve. Let's go ahead and have a listen to that. I don't know how to describe it, but there's a weird, like, honky mid-range tone, and it's kind of just this crispy guitar tone, and that's what always turned me off from amp sims. But the new tone that I've been able to achieve, I think, is very reminiscent of what you would hear through a real guitar amp and cab. I mean, it's chunky, it's aggressive, and like, if you listen really hard, like, there's maybe the slightest hint of some of that digital crispiness that I'm always complaining about, but it's so subtle, and it's at the point where it doesn't distract you from the song itself. And that's my main goal with guitar tone, is to have something that is good enough so that you can hear the song for what it is, and really enjoy it. Let's dive in, let's compare these two and see what actually went into making these guitar tones, and how my guitar tone evolved over time. So the first thing you need to know before shaping a guitar tone is you've got to have some kind of reference. You need to know what kind of sounds you like and what kind of guitar tone you're trying to achieve, because there's more than one way to make a good guitar tone. And I think that was probably my biggest problem with making guitar tones back then, is because I was sort of isolated. I wasn't using references. I was just going by memory and trying to make something that I thought sounded cool. So it's really important to take some time and listen to some of your favorite bands and try to compare the guitar tones and try to narrow down which guitar tone you like best. Now, my absolute favorite guitar tone is the X-Tol guitar tone from the 2013 album X-Tol. So here's a little snippet, have a listen. That chunk, that's what I really like. It's just, I don't know, it sounds so good. That's my favorite guitar tone. Another guitar tone I really like is the Periphery guitar tone, specifically from the song Remain Indoors. This one, I don't know, it has a type of chunk to it and a similar aggressiveness, but there's a little bit more clarity, and this tone is maybe a little bit more crunchy, but go ahead and have a listen to this tone. So that's the kind of guitar tone I like. So when I'm making my own tone, I want to listen to these and try my best to shape my guitar tone to sound as close as possible to my reference. Now at first that sounds simple, but you'll be surprised how much you'll have to go back and make adjustments. I used both of these tracks as a reference for my song A Place to Call Home, which I put out about a year ago. And at first I thought I had come up with something good, but they just weren't sitting in the mix right, and I had to do a lot to get them to work. So what I did for this song, I said, hey, I know, let me see if I can bounce out the finished guitars for my song A Place to Call Home, and then go back to the beginning and try to reshape the beginning tone to sound as close to the finished tone as possible. You following me? So basically what I did was I muted all the other instruments, and in my mixing phase, I bounced out a version of the song with just the guitar tones, and I sent it through the mastering plugins, and I brought it into a new project where I had the finished guitar tone. And then I took the DIs for the guitars, and I went back to my plugins, the very first plugins that I used to shape the tone, and I started making tweaks trying to get my starting tone to sound like the finished tone. So that's something that really helped me out. Now, when I start recording, I'm starting with a tone that already sounds like my finished tone. It sounds great. And that way, when I get to the mixing phase, I know that it's going to sit better with the drums and with the bass, and it's going to be a lot easier to mix, and it's not going to require so much processing. That's a huge tip right there. That really helped me get this guitar tone that I was able to achieve with this song. So let's go ahead and look at what kind of settings I am using for the guitar. So I've got both guitars here. This is my current guitar tone, and then this is the old guitar tone. So the thing that you need to keep in mind, this is actually my starting point. So I guess technically I'm using more plugins. Back then, I used to make my tone and mix in the same project. Now I do things a little bit differently. I have a separate project for creating the tone, and then I bounce that out, and I start a new project where I mix that track. That helps with the processing. You don't have to go through so many plugins, and it's also kind of nice just to commit to a tone and not think about all the other settings that you did and just focus on mixing. So the original tone was purely in Logic Pro. So I'm using these pedals here to kind of create some of the distortion. And then there's this Amp Designer plugin. Now in theory, this is a really cool plugin. You've got your amp and your cab here, and there's a lot of settings you can change, and there's a lot of different amps you can choose from and a lot of different cabs you can choose from. But unfortunately, they're not really that great. It's really difficult to get a good tone from this stuff. So what I would recommend is just downloading some free plugins. There's a lot of great stuff out there. So for my current tone, what I'm using, you need an impulse response loader. There's a few different ones. I like this one from Ignite Amps. And then you have to get some impulses. I've got another video where I talk more about that, so I'll post a link to that. But these load up your impulses, and that's actually going to be the biggest factor in your tone, is what impulses you're using. And then the next thing would be the amp. And I like this one, the Legion. And there's a couple other ones that are pretty good. This is not the only one. I've heard other people talk of others, but I have the most experience with this one, and I'm pretty satisfied with the tone I've been able to get out of it. So that's going to be your main settings for shaping your tone. And then there's a few other things. If we look at the old tone, you can see that I'm only using the pedal board and the Amp Designer for my tone, and then the next thing I use is an EQ, and you can see by the moves I'm doing, this is to help with the mix. I'm cutting out the low end, cutting out a little bit of the high end fizz, and trying to cut out some mud and boost some good mid-range stuff. I'm trying to get it to work in the mix. And then later I've got another EQ, and looks like I've got this exciter here, which I was probably trying to just add more high end. And then I've got a multipressor, which maybe was to stomp on the palm mutes, but I'm not really sure what I was using that for at the time. If we look at my new plugin chain, I've got a little bit of a different thing going on. All this is to help shape the tone. So again, when I went back and made those changes, when I used my finished tone and started listening, I started with the cab, and I noticed how tight the low end was. So I've actually got two impulses here. This is sort of the low end one. This is just to give like a little bit of body to the guitar. And then the main source of the tone is coming from this other cab here. This one's a bit more upfront and aggressive. And then together you get a well-balanced tone. You can hear as I'm cutting on and off that lower impulse, it just really fills out the guitar tone. Without it, it sounds kind of thin. Adding it in there just gives it a little more body. But you don't want to overdo it. There's this balance knob here, and I think before it was more like 25% over to the left side, so it was almost 50-50. But now I've got it all the way at 70%. Once you've got your cab set up, you want to dial in the details with your amp sim here. And I was listening to my reference tone, but I was also using analyzers. It's really helpful to use some kind of EQ analyzer plugin so that you can see where the information is at. You want to see like what part of the mid-range is boosted and where it's cut at, and you want to see how much high range there is, how much low range, and you want to try to match that as best you can. You want to use your ears, but those analyzers can sort of help you know what exactly you need to do. And so I made quite a few adjustments. I can't remember the adjustments right offhand, but I do remember having to come in here and tweak things pretty drastically. After that, I've got this TSE 808, which is kind of a overdrive plugin to help tighten up the low end. And I think I made some slight adjustments to this as well. I'm pretty sure I just leave this drive knob all the way down. And it's mainly this tone knob that I was just playing with the amount of tone and trying to find something that was close to my reference. Then there's this tube amplifier here. You can just kind of look at the settings that I've got set here. This is just more detail, so I kind of played around, and once again, every time I would adjust something, I would just compare it to my reference, and I would see which position would get me closest to my reference tone. Now, aside from that, there are a few other little things in there. There's this gain plugin that I've got, and you can see it's taking off 7 dB. So this gain plugin, it's happening first, so it's actually turning down the DI before it goes through all these plugins here. The peaks are kind of hanging around minus 10 dB. Now, I have to be honest, there's some kind of logic behind turning down your guitar DIs before you run them through the plugins, but I can't say that I remember what that reason is. I know there was some kind of video I watched, probably from Nail the Mix. Maybe that was just to find like a good sweet spot for the DIs. I'm not really sure. I've got a noise gate here that's pretty mandatory. You're just trying to get rid of those hums when you're not playing guitar because the amp can be quite loud. And then I've got a compressor that's happening before all the distortion. I like to compress the peaks of the DI so that I'm getting a more solid signal going into the distortion. So again, I'm just chopping off about 2, maybe 3 dB of peaks. It's a very low ratio and just pretty standard attack time and stuff. So that's basically my guitar tone. We can have a listen to it by itself. So it sounds pretty good, but to be honest, there's still a little bit of maybe mid-range honkiness going on and maybe a little bit of that crispy digital stuff going on. There's one last step that's really important to getting the guitar tone. Now, at this point, I would bounce this out and bring it over into my mixing phase. But before I start mixing, there's one more plugin I would add in, and it's this Match EQ plugin right here. So this Match EQ plugin is very important for the process. So basically the way this works, if there's a guitar tone that you want your guitar tone to sound like, you need a solo track of your reference tone, and you're going to drag that into this template here where it says Learn. And it will analyze the EQ curve of that guitar tone. Then you're going to click Current, and as you're playing your song, you want to play just your guitar track, and it'll listen and it'll start to analyze your guitar, and it'll analyze the EQ spectrum. Once you're done, you hit stop, you click this match button right here, and it'll sort of combine the two tones, and it'll create this EQ curve that brings them closer together. Usually you don't want to go 100% with this. You just want to apply this a subtle amount. So I typically do about 35%, and I set smoothing to 1 right here. Let's go ahead and have a listen to what this is doing. I'll cut it on and off. You hear how without it, it just sounds kind of congested, and as soon as you turn it on, it just opens it up. It gives it so much more air, so much more width. It's brighter, it's punchier, and it's even chunkier. So this is really important. So basically what I did, again, I would just use my X-Tol guitar tone and just drag that in as my reference. It's kind of hard because I couldn't find a solo track of just the X-Tol guitar tone, but there is a song, I think it's their song Betrayal, where there's a section where the guitar plays by itself. So I took that and that little section there, and that's all I had for my reference. And you can hear what that sounds like right here. You can hear there's like an odd little timing thing because I had to edit, and I grabbed another section and added to it to make it as long as I could, but that's all I had. But that was really helpful. And I took the X-Tol tone and I actually used the Match EQ to combine it with the Periphery tone. I love that tone, but it actually is a little bit woofy, a little muffled. And the Periphery tone is maybe a little crunchy, doesn't quite have the same chunk. So I sort of tried to combine the two to create this happy medium. And that's what I used for my reference for my tone. I'm gonna go ahead and compare my tone with the X-Tol and Periphery tone, and you'll hear that it's kind of in the ballpark. So it doesn't sound exactly the same, but it has a lot of the same characteristics. For free plugins, I'm pretty satisfied with how that tone came out. And then one last thing to keep in mind is your bass tone. Bass tone is going to play a huge role. I remember the old mix, the old song that we're using here as an example, when I did the bass tone for that, I didn't even run the bass through a cab. I just used the bass amp that came with Logic Pro. I thought amps had speakers. I didn't realize combo amps were their own thing and that you can actually have a separate amp and a separate cab. So I ran the bass DI through a bass amp and thought that's the finished tone, but the bass tone in that mix actually isn't going through a cab at all. So that itself is a big improvement. I've got a proper bass tone, and I'm actually quite pleased. If you listen to the intro of the song, you can hear the bass tone, and it's very clanky, it's very gritty. I'm pretty happy with how the bass tone came out. So when you've got those two guitars panned left and right, and you've got a bass tone like that, they're all just gonna work together and create this really great sound. So I'm just glad that I've got a tone that's this good, that I can just plug in and just start recording and just enjoy the music and not worry about the quality of my mix. I hope you found this video helpful. There's certain sections where you can go back and just kind of watch the settings that I used, and hopefully those settings will work for you. Thanks for watching. Until next time.